The salt-stained brick walls of Fort Sumter stood defiantly in Charleston Harbor, like a stubborn thumb pressed into the eye of South Carolina's pride. Major Robert Anderson knew that every sunrise brought him closer to a moment that would either secure his place in history or seal his tomb beneath the fortress he commanded. It was early April of 1861, and the air itself seemed to crackle with the tension of a nation teetering on the precipice of war. Anderson paced the ramparts of the pentagonal fortress, his weathered boots echoing against the stone, as he surveyed the hostile shoreline that surrounded him on three sides. Confederate batteries had been steadily multiplying along the harbor's edge. Like mushrooms after rain, their dark muzzles trained directly on his modest garrison of fewer than 100 men. The irony was not lost on him that he, a Kentucky-born officer who had once owned slaves, now found himself the unlikely symbol of Union defiance in the heart of secession territory. The fort had become a prison of sorts, not just for Anderson and his men, but for the entire nation's hopes of avoiding the unthinkable. President Abraham Lincoln, barely 2 months into his presidency, faced an impossible choice: abandon the fort and appear weak before a fractured nation, or reinforce it and risk igniting the very conflict he desperately sought to avoid. Every day that passed without resolution only tightened the noose around diplomacy's neck. South Carolina's governor, Francis Pickens, had made his position abundantly clear through a series of increasingly hostile communications. The Palmetto State, as it proudly called itself, would not tolerate the presence of what they considered foreign troops on sovereign soil. Confederate Brigadier General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, a man whose military credentials were as impressive as his name was elaborate, had been tasked with the delicate mission of forcing the fort's surrender, without appearing as the aggressor in the eyes of the still undecided border states. The siege had begun not with cannons, but with commerce. Supply ships were turned away at gunpoint, mail was intercepted, and even the most basic necessities became precious commodities within the fort's walls. Anderson's men subsisted on salt pork and hardtack, their uniforms growing more threadbare with each passing day. The psychological warfare was as effective as any artillery bombardment might have been. Historical accounts from the Charleston Mercury newspaper of this period detail the mounting tensions and daily preparations for conflict that gripped the city. Citizens gathered along the harbor's edge each morning, some hoping to witness history, others praying they would not. Children played at being soldiers in the streets, unknowingly rehearsing for a tragedy that would consume their childhood and reshape their world. As Anderson stood watch during those final peaceful nights, he could see the campfires of Confederate troops dotting the shoreline like fallen stars. Each flickering light represented young men who, in many cases, had trained alongside his own soldiers in the years before politics tore their professional brotherhood asunder. The coming battle would pit former classmates from West Point against one another, friends against friends, in a conflict that would prove far costlier than anyone on either side could possibly imagine. The stage was set for the opening act of America's greatest tragedy, and Major Anderson held the match that would light the fuse. The morning of April 11th, 1861, dawned gray and oppressive over Charleston Harbor. As if nature itself sensed the momentous events about to unfold, Major Anderson received word that 3 Confederate officers were requesting permission to board Fort Sumter under a flag of truce, carrying what he suspected would be the final ultimatum from General Beauregard. The major's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his uniform, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that his next words might echo through generations of American history. The Confederate delegation, led by Colonel James Chestnut, Jr. and Captain Stephen Lee, rode across the choppy harbor waters with the dignity befitting such a solemn occasion. Chestnut, a former United States Senator who had resigned his position when South Carolina seceded, carried himself with the bearing of a man convinced of the righteousness of his cause. As they climbed the fort's stone steps, the sound of their boots seemed to count down the final moments of peace. Anderson met them in his modest quarters, a sparsely furnished room that had become the unlikely epicenter of national attention. The terms presented were straightforward and, under different circumstances, might have been considered generous. surrender the fort with full military honors, march out with arms and personal property, and depart unmolested for any United States post. No blood need be shed, no careers destroyed, no martyrs created for either cause. The major listened with the stoic professionalism that had defined his 36-year military career. But his answer came without hesitation. His duty, his oath, and his conscience all pointed in the same direction. Fort Sumter would remain in Union hands until properly relieved or overwhelmed by superior force. The Confederate officers nodded with what appeared to be genuine regret, shook Anderson's hand with the courtesy of gentlemen, and departed to deliver news that would seal the fate of both their missions. President Lincoln's relief expedition, led by Captain Gustavus Fox, was already steaming toward Charleston Harbor. Though Anderson remained unaware of this crucial development, the president had chosen a middle path, sending supplies but not reinforcements, hoping to force the Confederates into the role of aggressor, while still maintaining the Union's presence in the harbor. It was a political calculation born of desperation, but one that would prove fatally flawed. General Beauregard received his final instructions from Confederate President Jefferson Davis through Secretary of War Leroy Walker. If Anderson refused to surrender and Union relief ships appeared on the horizon, Fort Sumter was to be reduced by bombardment. Davis, despite his own military background and understanding of warfare's terrible costs, had concluded that the Confederacy's credibility demanded action. A paper nation needed a real victory to transform political rhetoric into undeniable reality. The night of April 11th passed like a funeral vigil, with both sides making their final preparations. Confederate artillery crews performed last-minute adjustments to their guns, checking elevation and calculating trajectories with the precision of men who understood that their first shots must be true. Within Fort Sumter, Anderson gathered his officers for what might be their final conference, assigning duties and contingencies with the methodical thoroughness of a professional soldier. Contemporary accounts from Confederate Colonel James Chestnut's diary reveal the emotional weight carried by those who would fire the first shots, describing the mixture of excitement and dread that pervaded the Charleston batteries. As midnight approached, Anderson found himself alone on the fort's highest parapet, gazing across the water at the lights of Charleston. The city that had once welcomed him as a fellow Southerner now bristled with hostile intent, its church spires silhouetted against the sky like accusing fingers. Tomorrow would bring either salvation or catastrophe, and Major Robert Anderson knew that the choice was no longer his to make. The die had been cast, and all that remained was to see where it would fall. At precisely 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, the pre-dawn silence of Charleston Harbor shattered like glass beneath a hammer's blow. The first shot of what would become America's Civil War erupted from a Confederate mortar battery on James Island, its shell tracing a deadly arc across the dark water before exploding directly over Fort Sumter. Major Anderson and his garrison, roused from uneasy sleep by the thunderous detonation, knew instantly that their long vigil had ended and their trial by fire had begun. General Beauregard had orchestrated the bombardment with mathematical precision, positioning 43 guns in a semicircle round the isolated fortress. From Fort Moultrie to the north, Sullivan's Island to the east, and Morris Island to the south, Confederate artillery pieces opened fire in a carefully choreographed symphony of destruction. The sound was unlike anything the region had ever experienced, a continuous rolling thunder that rattled windows in Charleston and could be heard for miles inland. Anderson faced an impossible tactical situation. His garrison of 85 men commanded 48 guns, but most were positioned on the fort's upper level, where his soldiers would be exposed to the devastating crossfire. Now raining down upon them, with characteristic prudence, he ordered his men to fight from the lower casemated positions, effectively reducing his return fire by more than half, but preserving the lives of soldiers who would be needed for the siege he knew was coming. Captain Abner Doubleday, Anderson's second in command and a man whose name would later be erroneously associated with baseball's invention, fired Fort Sumter's first responding shot at approximately 7 o'clock that morning. The ball struck the iron battery on Morris Island, sending Confederate gunners diving for cover and eliciting cheers from the Union defenders. It was a moment of defiance that would be remembered long after the tactical situation became hopeless. The bombardment continued throughout the morning with relentless intensity. Confederate shells crashed into the fort's brick walls, sending chunks of masonry flying like deadly missiles. The garrison's wooden quarters caught fire repeatedly, forcing Anderson's men to divide their attention between returning fire and preventing the fortress from becoming an inferno. Smoke from burning buildings mixed with gun smoke to create a choking haze that made breathing difficult and visibility nearly impossible. Records from the Charleston Mercury's war correspondents, who observed the battle from the city's rooftops, described the spectacle as both magnificent and terrifying, with shells exploding like deadly fireworks against the fortress walls. By noon, the situation inside Fort Sumter had become desperate. The bombardment had damaged the fort's flagstaff 3 times, requiring increasingly dangerous missions to restore the stars and stripes to its proper position. Each time the flag fell, Confederate gunners would cheer, thinking surrender was imminent, only to curse when brave Union soldiers risked their lives to raise it again. These small acts of defiance became symbols of Northern determination that would inspire countless recruitment posters in the months ahead. Anderson's greatest concern was not the enemy fire, devastating though it was, but the dwindling supply of ammunition. His gunners were rationed to 6 rounds per gun per day, a restriction that made effective counter-battery fire impossible. Food supplies, already low before the bombardment began, were running dangerously short, and the fort's cisterns had been damaged by shell fragments, contaminating much of their fresh water supply. As the sun began to set on that historic day, painting the smoke-filled harbor in shades of red that seemed prophetic of the bloodshed to come, both sides took stock of their situation. The Confederates had demonstrated their resolve and military capability without suffering significant casualties. Anderson's garrison had proven their courage and determination, but faced the mathematical certainty of eventual defeat. The first day of America's Civil War had ended in a draw that favored the besiegers, setting the stage for a surrender that would echo through history. The second day of bombardment dawned with renewed Confederate fury, as if General Beauregard had spent the night calculating exactly how to maximize pressure on the beleaguered garrison. By 8 o'clock in the morning of April 13, 1861, the rate of fire had intensified dramatically, with Confederate gunners demonstrating an accuracy that spoke to both their skill and their intimate knowledge of Fort Sumter's weaknesses. Major Anderson knew that his situation had moved from desperate to impossible, but his sense of duty demanded that he extract every possible hour of resistance from his dwindling resources. The fort's main magazine had become a source of constant anxiety rather than strength. Confederate hotshot iron cannonballs heated red-hot in furnaces before firing had ignited multiple fires throughout the wooden structures within the fortress walls. Anderson made the agonizing decision to seal the main powder magazine to prevent a catastrophic explosion that would kill his entire garrison instantly. This decision effectively ended any hope of sustained resistance, as his remaining ammunition consisted of fewer than 40 rounds, scattered throughout the fort's various positions. Captain Doubleday and the other officers gathered in Anderson's quarters during a brief lull in the bombardment, their faces blackened with smoke and their uniforms torn from flying debris. The major's decision was evident in his expression before he spoke a word. They had fulfilled their duty, demonstrated Union resolve, and proven that the federal government would not abandon its posts without a fight. To continue resistance would accomplish nothing but the needless sacrifice of brave men's lives. The white flag appeared over Fort Sumter at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, sewn together from bed sheets and raised by Private Daniel Huff, a young soldier from Ireland who had enlisted seeking American citizenship and found himself in Stia, making American history. Confederate batteries ceased fire immediately, their gunners cheering with the relief of men who had proven their point without committing wholesale slaughter. Historical documentation from Confederate Secretary of War Leroy Walker's official correspondence reveals the South's anxiety about appearing too aggressive. In the eyes of European powers who might provide crucial support, General Beauregard's aide, Colonel Lewis Wigfall reached the fort before official surrender negotiations began, having rowed across the harbor in his eagerness to confirm the Union capitulation. The colonel, a former United States senator from Texas whose political career had been built on fiery secessionist rhetoric, now found himself face to face with the human cost of his convictions. Anderson received him with the dignity of a professional soldier. Explaining his terms, he would surrender the fort, but demanded the right to salute his flag and march out with full military honors, Beauregard, demonstrating the chivalric traditions of his Louisiana upbringing, granted Anderson's requests. Without hesitation, the Confederate general had achieved his primary objective, without suffering a single combat casualty, a feat that spoke to both his tactical skill and his understanding of the political dimensions of the conflict. More importantly, he recognized that magnanimity in victory would serve the Confederate cause better than petty humiliation of defeated opponents. The formal surrender ceremony was scheduled for the following day, April 14th, allowing both sides to prepare for what everyone understood would be a moment of profound historical significance. Anderson spent that final night in Fort Sumter composing his official report to the War Department, choosing his words carefully as he described the end of federal authority in Charleston Harbor. His men cleaned their weapons, mended their uniforms, and prepared to march out with the pride that comes from duty faithfully performed under impossible circumstances. As the sun set on Fort Sumter's last night under Union control, Anderson walked the ramparts one final time, surveying the damage inflicted by 34 hours of continuous bombardment. The walls that had seemed so formidable just 2 days earlier now bore the scars of more than 3,000 Confederate shells. Tomorrow, he would lower the flag he had defended so courageously, but he would do so with honor intact and conscience clear. The opening chapter of America's Civil War was ending, but Major Robert Anderson had ensured it would be remembered as a story of courage, rather than cowardice. April 14th, 1861, broke clear and bright over Charleston Harbor, as if nature herself wished to illuminate the historic ceremony about to unfold. Major Anderson had slept little during his final night in Fort Sumter, spending the hours before dawn composing letters to his wife and reviewing the complex emotions that accompanied his surrender. The morning air carried an unusual silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of harbor waves against the fortress walls, and the distant sounds of Charleston awakening to witness the end of federal presence in their proud city. The surrender ceremony began at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with Anderson's garrison assembled in their dress uniforms despite the wear and damage of the preceding battle. The major had insisted on military protocol, understanding that how they departed Fort Sumter would be remembered long after the tactical details of the bombardment were forgotten. His men stood at attention with the bearing of soldiers who had acquitted themselves honorably in their first test of war, their faces reflecting both exhaustion and pride. General Beauregard had granted Anderson the right to fire a 100-gun salute to the American flag before lowering it for the final time. The Confederate commander's generosity in victory demonstrated the chivalric code that many hoped would govern the conflict, though subsequent events would prove such optimism tragically misplaced. As the ceremony commenced, Confederate officers and Charleston civilians gathered along the harbor's edge to witness what they believed would be the bloodless conclusion of their revolution. The salute began with solemn precision, each cannon firing in sequence as the stars and stripes fluttered proudly above the battle-scarred fortress. Anderson had chosen his most experienced gunners for this final duty, men whose skill and dedication had been proven during the bombardment. The sound of each discharge echoed across the harbor with ceremonial dignity, a funeral dirge for federal authority in South Carolina, but also a promise of eventual return. Tragedy struck during the 50th round of the salute when Private Daniel Howe's cannon misfired, the premature explosion tearing off his right arm and mortally wounding him instantly. Private Edward Galloway was also severely injured in the accident, dying from his wounds several days later. The irony was bitter beyond description. The bombardment that had brought down Fort Sumter claimed no lives, but the ceremony of surrender created the conflict's first casualties through a cruel twist of fate. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the New York Tribune documented the profound impact these first deaths had on Northern public opinion, transforming what might have been viewed as a bloodless political dispute into a personal tragedy requiring vengeance. Anderson immediately halted the salute, ordering his men to tend to their wounded comrades while maintaining the dignity appropriate to such a solemn occasion. Huff died within minutes, his blood staining the same stones he had helped defend. With such courage just hours earlier, the major knelt beside the young private, offering what comfort he could to a soldier who had sought American citizenship and instead became American history's first Civil War casualty. The flag-lowering ceremony continued with heavy hearts, Anderson personally folding the banner that had flown defiantly through 34 hours of bombardment. He tucked the stars and stripes inside his uniform, determined to preserve this symbol of federal resistance for future generations. As the last Union soldier departed Fort Sumter, Confederate troops marched in to claim their prize, but the victory felt hollow in the shadow of unnecessary death. Anderson's garrison departed Charleston Harbor aboard the steamship Baltic, their destination New York City, and a hero's welcome that awaited them throughout the North. As their ship passed beyond the harbor's mouth, the major stood at the stern, watching Fort Sumter disappear behind them, knowing that he had played his part in launching a conflict whose dimensions no one could yet imagine. The surrender of Fort Sumter was complete, but Major Robert Anderson had achieved something more valuable than military victory. He had provided the Union cause with its first martyrs and its first heroes, creating a narrative of honorable resistance that would inspire Northern recruitment for years to come. The Confederate victory was tactical, but Anderson's defeat was strategic, transforming a political crisis into a moral crusade that would sustain Union resolve. Through 4 years of unprecedented bloodshed, the news of Fort Sumter's surrender raced across the telegraph wires faster than any cavalry could ride, reaching every corner of the fractured nation within hours of Major Anderson's departure. From Charleston Harbor, in Washington, President Lincoln received word of the bombardment while meeting with his cabinet, the color draining from his face as he realized that his careful political calculations had been swept away by the thunder of Confederate guns. The war he had desperately sought to avoid was now upon him, and the American people would demand a response equal to their outrage. Northern newspapers exploded with headlines that transformed a military setback into a call for national vengeance. The New York Tribune declared the war begun in letters so large they could be read from across the street, while the Philadelphia Inquirer proclaimed the die is cast with righteous fury. Editorial writers who had counseled moderation just days earlier now demanded immediate and overwhelming retaliation against what they characterized as Southern treachery. The bombardment of Fort Sumter had provided the North with something it desperately needed: moral clarity and unified purpose. Lincoln's response came on April 15, 1861, with a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days to suppress the rebellion and reclaim federal property. The president's language was carefully measured, avoiding inflammatory rhetoric while making his intentions unmistakably clear. The federal government would not recognize secession, would not abandon its constitutional responsibilities, and would use whatever force necessary to preserve the Union that had been consecrated by the blood of previous generations. The response to Lincoln's call exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. In Massachusetts, the 6th Regiment began marching toward Washington within hours of receiving orders, their rapid deployment becoming a source of New England pride that would be celebrated in song and story. Ohio's Governor, William Dennison, telegraphed Washington offering 20 regiments instead of the 13 requested, declaring that the Buckeye State would not be found wanting. In its hour of national crisis, military recruitment records from the National Archives demonstrate that more than 100,000 men volunteered for service within the first week following Lincoln's proclamation, overwhelming the government's ability to process and equip such numbers. The South's reaction to Lincoln's call for volunteers was equally dramatic, but opposite in character. Virginia's legislature, which had voted against secession just days earlier, reconvened an emergency session and passed an ordinance of secession. By a margin of 88 to 55, Governor John Letcher declared that Virginia would never permit federal troops to march across her soil to subjugate sister states. Regardless of the constitutional arguments involved, within days of Fort Sumter's surrender, 3 more states had joined the Confederacy. Arkansas seceded on May 6th, North Carolina on May 20th, and Tennessee on June 8th, bringing the total number of Confederate states to 11. The bombardment that Jefferson Davis had hoped would strengthen Southern resolve had instead provided the catalyst for a continental war that would consume resources and lives on a scale unimaginable to the politicians who had precipitated it. Major Anderson, meanwhile, found himself transformed from a relatively obscure Army officer into a national hero whose name was cheered in northern cities and cursed in southern drawing rooms. Upon reaching New York Harbor, he was greeted by cannon salutes and crowds of admirers who viewed his defense of Fort Sumter as emblematic of federal determination. The major's dignified bearing and obvious emotional exhaustion only enhanced his appeal to a northern public, hungry for heroes in a conflict that had yet to produce any clear victories. The Confederate leadership watched these developments with growing alarm, realizing that their carefully planned demonstration of resolve had backfired spectacularly. Instead of intimidating the Lincoln administration into recognizing Southern independence, the bombardment of Fort Sumter had provided the North with precisely the unifying event it needed to mobilize for war. Jefferson Davis and his advisors had calculated that Northern resolve would crumble in the face of determined Southern resistance, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the psychology of a democratic nation responding to what it perceived as unprovoked aggression. As April gave way to May of 1861, both sides began the massive mobilization that would transform their agricultural societies into military powers capable of waging industrial warfare on an unprecedented scale. The shots fired at Fort Sumter had awakened a sleeping giant, and the thunder of those first guns would echo through for years of bloodshed that would reshape the American continent forever. 4 years after the last Confederate shell struck Fort Sumter's brick walls, Major Robert Anderson returned to Charleston Harbor aboard a Union vessel, his hair now completely gray and his face bearing the weight of a war that had consumed more than 600,000 American lives. It was April 14th, 1865, exactly 4 years after his surrender, and Anderson carried with him the same flag he had folded and preserved during those dark hours when Confederate victory seemed inevitable. The wheel of history had completed its terrible revolution. The fort that greeted Anderson's return bore little resemblance to the proud fortress he had defended in 1861. 4 years of intermittent bombardment during the Union siege of Charleston had reduced much of the structure to rubble, its walls pocked with shell holes and its interior filled with debris from collapsed buildings. Yet the flag would fly again over Fort Sumter, and Anderson would have the honor of raising the same stars and stripes he had lowered in defeat. 4 years earlier, the ceremony on April 14th, 1865, attracted thousands of spectators, including many of the same Charleston citizens who had cheered the fort's surrender. At the war's beginning, the mood was markedly different now, subdued by the knowledge of what their defiance had cost. Sherman's march through Georgia and South Carolina had demonstrated the Union's terrible capacity for destruction, while Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse just 5 days earlier had finally ended the Confederacy's dreams of independence. Anderson's hands trembled slightly as he raised the flag, not from age or infirmity, but from the overwhelming emotion of the moment. The same banner that had been fired upon by Confederate guns now flew triumphantly over a reunited nation, though the price of that reunion had proven far higher than anyone had imagined in those early days of 1861. The Major's brief speech emphasized reconciliation and healing rather than victory and vengeance, reflecting his hope that the war's end might bring genuine peace, rather than merely the cessation of hostilities. Historical records from the War Department archives reveal that Anderson specifically requested permission to perform this ceremony, viewing it as the completion of his military duty and the fulfillment of a promise made during the war's darkest hours. The significance of Fort Sumter's role in American history extended far beyond its tactical importance as a harbor fortress. The bombardment that began the Civil War had demonstrated how quickly political disputes could escalate into armed conflict. When compromise became impossible and principle became paramount, Anderson's defense had shown that ordinary soldiers could become heroes through simple adherence to duty, while his surrender had proven that honor could be maintained even in defeat. The war that began with Fort Sumter's bombardment transformed the United States from a loose confederation of sovereign states into a unified nation. With a powerful federal government, the economic and social changes wrought by 4 years of total war created the foundation for America's emergence as a major industrial power, while the constitutional amendments passed during Reconstruction finally fulfilled the Founding Fathers' promise that all men were created equal. For Major Anderson personally, the war's end brought both vindication and melancholy. He had lived to see his flag raised again over Fort Sumter, but the cost of that victory weighed heavily upon him. The young soldiers who had served under him during the bombardment were now seasoned veterans, if they had survived, while others, like Private Huff, had become casualties of a conflict that began with their courage and ended with their sacrifice. The thunder that began at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, had finally fallen silent, but its echoes would resonate through American history for generations to come. The fortress in Charleston Harbor became a symbol of both division and reunion, a reminder of how quickly democratic societies could fragment when sectional interests overcame national loyalty. More importantly, it demonstrated that the American experiment in self-government could survive even the most severe tests, emerging stronger and more unified from trials that might have destroyed less resilient nations. As Anderson departed Charleston Harbor for the final time, leaving Fort Sumter to the care of peacetime garrisons, he carried with him the knowledge that his defense of an isolated fortress had helped preserve the Union that now stretched from sea to shining sea. The major who had once worried about his place in history could rest assured that his name would be remembered as long as Americans valued courage, duty, and devotion to constitutional government. The thunder of Fort Sumter had launched a war that saved the nation, and Robert Anderson had fired the first shot in democracy's defense.